Well, welcome everybody to the third annual event of Scotland's Landscape Alliance. My name's Stuart Brooks and I'm the co-chair of the Alliance along with Rachel Tennant, who's chairing one of the working group debates today. So we had envisaged that we'd come together physically in Linlithgow for this event, but we asked you, and your strong preference actually was to meet again online, and of course we're kind of happy to accommodate that. So I just want to mention just a few Zoom kind of housekeeping things before we get going, if that's all right. So you'll have just heard the little announcement there. We are recording the event. We're just recording the event in the main meeting room here. So we won't be recording the actual debates in the breakout sessions. Just make sure that if you know how to do it, it would be really helpful if you could just ensure that your name, your Zoom name, is your name. So not your kid's name or your cat's name or whatever, but if it's your name. And that just makes it much easier for us to be able to kind of make a note of everybody's attendance and which breakout rooms that they're in. So if you've told us which breakout room and which debate that you want to enter into, that's great. If you haven't done so already, my colleague Janine from NTS will actually just assign you into one of the breakout rooms. So if you've told us, great, we'll put you in the one that you asked for. If you haven't, you'll just be assigned one. And Janine will be doing that just now. If you want to kind of make an intervention in your breakout rooms, then please just use the raise hand function on Zoom, and we'd be very grateful if everybody could just keep themselves on mute while other people are talking. There's a chat function as well, both in the breakout rooms and in the main session here. So please use that too, and we'll try and respond to that as we go along, and so will our speakers. So before we begin, I just wanted to say a few words actually about the SLA, Scotland's Landscape Alliance, our origins and purpose, and what we've done in the lead up to this event. I'm conscious that some of you have been engaged with us really from the outset, but we've got some new people here too, which is brilliant. So the SLA is an organisation for people and organisations with a common interest in raising awareness of the importance of landscape for public benefit. So whether that be for health and well-being or the environment or our economy. So we founded on a vision here to strengthen the benefits and contribution that landscapes can make to the UN SDGs and Scotland's national outcomes within the context of the European Landscape Convention. So we think landscapes, and I'm sure you do too, can play a key role in benefiting people's lives. And we also think that we are currently missing some of the opportunities to maximise those benefits. We reached that conclusion following a debate in the Scottish Parliament in 2018, convened by the Landscape Institute Scotland, led by Rachel at the time. And a group of committed organisations founded the SLA thereafter around a common vision, a purpose and objectives that you can see here. Not least to reinvigorate the landscape community. We are the landscape community. So that's been pretty challenging over the last period during the pandemic, but we're still here, and that's great. Through a collaboration process led by can we go on to the next slide, please, Miriam? Thank you. So through a collaborative process led by the Executive Committee, we worked towards and published a major publication, Landscape and Place for Success, in September 2020. And we're very grateful for the chairs who led those groups and everyone who contributed. And our landscape community came together then to discuss the outcomes. And I know that the Scottish Government and Nature Scot welcome this type of opportunity and the leadership really being shown by the SLA. Thanks, Miriam. So within our publication, we had a call for action for landscape to be seen as part of the critical infrastructure of our nation. And we need joined up policy and a greater recognition of the impact that landscape has on public benefit and national outcomes. And I know you all agree landscapes really do matter. We also set out, go to the next slide, please, Miriam, thank you. We also set out some detailed recommendations for change. So if you can't quite get through that slide quickly enough, we're calling for increased Scotland's resilience to climate change and associated environmental challenges, to improve the health and well-being of people in Scotland and reduce health inequalities, and support integrated land uses and deliver inclusive growth in Scotland's economy. So we included those recommendations in a suite of publications that focused on resilience to climate change, health and well-being, land use and economy. So you can see the kind of follow through really from the master document and then the more detailed position statements. All of these, by the way, are on the SLA website. And I think it's best to see these publications really as the starting point for the SLA. So they make the case for landscape and why we need to actively consider it, rather than it just being the invisible context for sectoral policies such as biodiversity, housing or agriculture. So these publications were well received, and we've been pretty busy communicating our recommendations since that debate that we had last year, similar time last year, with decision makers. And we've had some really constructive discussions with different bits of Scottish Government and Nature Scot in particular. And I should point out really from the outset, the SLA wasn't constituted as a campaigning or lobbying group. And you'll appreciate that our membership is pretty broad and it does include some public bodies within it. But we needed to continue and see how best we could align our work with the emerging opportunities being presented as we recover from the pandemic. And I think everybody who kind of works in the policy area will just know how rapidly things do move on, and actually just the kind of sheer volume of kind of policy activity that we have to engage with as a body interested in landscape. So with input from yourselves, the Executive Committee decided to focus on 4 aspects of national policy where we thought landscape could and should feature more prominently and have more impact. So these 4 areas form the focus of the debate today. And we're focusing on the 30 by 30 protected area targets, social renewal and the role of landscape in tackling inequality and exclusion, the climate action plan and development of landscape indicators in the context of the developing environment strategy. So this is the last slide, I think, and just a reminder really of the agenda and the running order for today. Yeah, we're just about on time. So our speakers will provide a 10-minute presentation each of the work in progress so far of the 4 working groups. We'll have a short break before everybody comes back, before being zoomed off into their breakout rooms, where we want you to pick up the discussion. So this is a really important part of the process and really the kind of main point of today. The chairs really want to get your input here, challenge also, and your advice. And we've got some scribes lined up in the breakout rooms, and our chairs will attempt to sum up from their sessions and report back. Everybody will come back together again in the main room here at 11:30. Okay, so let's get going. So our first topic chair then is John Thompson. And John probably wears many hats, but the one he's got on top of his head today is the chair of the APRS. So over to you, John, if that's all right. Oops.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, John.
As Stuart says, I'm John Thompson. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Um, I'm flying under slightly false colours today because I've been described as the chair of the SLA working group. The working group concerned was actually chaired by Rebecca Hughes, who is my vice chair at APRS. But she wasn't available today, so I'm standing in for her. And you can blame me for any faults in what follows. I thought I ought to start just by providing a little bit of background on 30 by 30, because although some of us are only too familiar with it, probably not all of you are. So 30 by 30 is a commitment that the Scottish government and the UK government, and indeed increasing number of governments around the world, have given to protecting 30% of their land area for nature by 2030. And that is obviously potentially a hugely significant commitment for tackling the nature emergency and indeed the climate emergency. But what on earth does it mean? What can be counted as land that is protected for nature? And at the same time, the Scottish Government, as part of their agreement with the Scottish Greens, have committed themselves to create at least one new national park by 2026, i.e. during the course of the current Parliament. And national parks have always been designated as, on the basis of their landscape interest, or in terms of the 2020 Act, their natural and cultural heritage interest. And as such, they've been included in the IUCN's classification of protected areas as protected landscapes, that's category 5, as indeed were both the national scenic areas in Scotland and our regional parks, although they've more recently in the last decade been stripped of that status because they lack effective management. Whether or not they are recognised, I think all Scotland's protected landscapes, the national parks, NSAs and regional parks, and indeed all our wider landscapes, are undoubtedly cultural in the sense that they bear the imprint of millennia of human activity of one sort or another. And the aim of protected landscapes has always been to manage them as such. So the question that now arises is if and to what extent those protected landscapes can be regarded as being, in the terms of the 30 by 30 commitment, protected for nature, which raises indeed the question of how far the aims of landscape and nature conservation coincide or diverge. The UK has always been a bit of an outlier in distinguishing rather firmly between the two. But the creation of SNH, which is now 30 years back almost, was intended to bring the two together. But in practice, they've never been fully reconciled. So I think an underlying question now is the 30 by 30 target a prompt to have another go at really better assimilating them? And if so, on what basis? And the rest of my presentation is really going to be devoted to highlighting some of the issues that we identified in the working group, which had 2 meetings and a number of email exchanges, which are relevant to those questions. So, as I say, the fundamental question, if you like, is can the landscape and nature protection agendas be mutually supportive? And within that, can landscape policy and protected landscapes help to deliver the 30 by 30 nature protection target? And is that 30 by 30 target an opportunity to advance the cause of landscape care and protection, which is obviously very much at the heart of the SLA's activities? And within that, the sort of points for discussion are, what is the nature that's being protected? Is it just biodiversity? Is it the full range of ecosystem services which our environment provides? Where's that protection needed? Are we really focusing just on protected sites, or are we looking much more widely? And what kind of protection should it be? Is it prescriptive management of the kind that's associated with traditional SSSIs, for example, or minimum intervention, or indeed where on the whole spectrum between those two options should it lie? And then how can it be delivered? And can landscape thinking approaches help with that? So breaking those down and taking the issues separately, first point is the one I've really already made in talking about cultural landscapes, that people are part of nature. We've been shaping it for millennia, particularly in long inhabited countries like Scotland, and we continue fundamentally to depend on it in a whole range of different ways. So the underlying challenge is to find a way of living successfully as an integral element within that wider whole. And that means ensuring that our natural systems remain capable of fulfilling all the demands that we place upon them. And those, importantly from a landscape standpoint, include the aesthetic as well as the material, and the intangible as well as the tangible. Where do we need protection? Well, we were pretty clear in the group that we really need more space for nature everywhere. We are not really going to protect our ecosystems unless we treat them properly throughout the land, and indeed obviously the sea, to which the 30 by 30 commitment also applies, but it's being treated rather separately there. Protected areas themselves must obviously be on an adequate scale, but they also need to be networked and set within a countryside that overall is managed in the interests of sustainable use. Protected sites alone are not enough. They have to be nodes within a broader context of links and of responsible stewardship, which takes you back to the previous points. And it means tailoring the management of all land and water to the character, needs, role and objectives of that particular location. What sort of protection are we talking about? Well, again, I've mentioned a spectrum, and I think it was very clear to us that you would require management of very different kinds in different places. But in order to achieve that, you obviously require some process for establishing agreed objectives. And those options and objectives should be subject to discussion and negotiation within the framework of some form of broader strategy for the country as a whole. They really have to be done at a relatively local level, but within a firm context. And finally, can landscape thinking and approaches help? We felt that the all landscapes matter philosophy is entirely consistent with that, the aim of creating space for nature everywhere. Landscape thinking can inject the necessary human dimension to all the discussions over protecting nature. Importantly, given the right brief, and we weren't pretending that they necessarily currently had the right brief, but given the right brief and adequate resources, protected landscapes could be key agents in providing adequate protection, both on designated sites, but also importantly, more widely. And that in doing so, they could actually set an example. They could provide green prints for other places. And finally, the long-standing emphasis that landscape conservation has placed on managing change was actually well geared to convincing people of the sort of far-reaching action that was needed to tackle the two linked emergencies that we currently face. So overall, we reached the conclusions, which are obviously very much provisional at this stage, but we thought that with dialogue, imagination and flexibility, there clearly was a potential for mutual benefit between our agenda as landscape, those concerned with landscape, and that of those concerned with protecting nature. Landscape thinking emphasises very much that it is about ends and not means. Just what do we require to achieve the underlying objective of the 30 by 30 target, which is natural systems which are everywhere healthy, rewarding and open to all, even if they are very different in character. and that protected landscapes, if they were rightly tasked and resourced, could play a key part in delivering this vision and in demonstrating to others how it can be done. So those were our very provisional conclusions, but I look forward to the opportunity to discuss them in the breakout session. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, John, for that. So we're going to move on now, if we can, to Rachel Tennant. Rachel's going to be focused on responding to the Social Renewal Advisory Board's report and their draft outcomes.
Thanks, Stuart, and thanks, John. Welcome, everyone. Great that you could all join us. I am the chair of Working Group 2, and I want to thank all the group for their participation and input in this. So the Social Renewal Advisory Board was set up by the Scottish Government to present transformational ideas on how to deliver real change for Scotland after the pandemic. And our group have responded to their recommendations in the context of how landscape can address the current issues of inequality and exclusion faced by those in our most deprived communities. So we first looked at the key links into the report findings and grouped them around people and their needs, the network of people, and measuring success. And then we developed 3 framing questions to examine each of these areas. And we reviewed each question on the basis of the opportunities, the barriers, and how we overcome them to achieve best practice, and showcasing what good looks like and what we need to do more of in Scotland. Our key outcome is based on the programme for government for a fairer, greener Scotland, that landscape can help support resilient, inclusive and diverse communities and deliver on a green recovery. And we believe it is an essential part of the solution. We have 7 draft summary recommendations which we'll debate today. But before that, I want to do a quick resume of how we got to these, and importantly show you examples of best practice that we found that demonstrate what we're hoping to achieve. So I would like to introduce Danny McKendry from Architecture and Design Scotland, who will present what landscape can deliver for climate resilience and housing and place.
Thanks, Rachel. I hope everybody can hear me and hopefully see as well. So thanks. So if you go on to the next slide, please. So we looked at, as was mentioned before, opportunities and barriers and overcoming barriers. And I think the opportunities approach, that kind of mindset, was really, really important here. And around climate change, the key things that were coming out were the need to work at a landscape scale for nature-based solutions to deliver on multiple benefits. So that kind of scaling and alignment, that idea that the recognition that we need to have a unified approach to the work around climate change based on the place principle, and there needs to be greater public education messaging around the importance of active travel and its relationship with climate resilience. There's lots and lots of things in terms of joined up working that are required there. We need to be very focused on looking at vacant and derelict land and what that can do. Again, to help this, look at new funding models, be innovative, create more quality green space across a wide range of environments so people can link into that, and really be aware of the role that peatland and woodland expansion can have in terms of delivering on a wide range of benefits. You move on next, please. Thanks. One of the pieces of work we like to flag up is work that Architecture and Design Scotland have been working on carbon conscious places, where we approached a number of different locations, up in Moray, at the town of Elgin, the National Park at Loch Lomond and Trossachs, out in the Islands at Shetland, and work in the city level at Glasgow, looking at what changes can be made in terms of different types of landscape at different scales to address climate change. Next slide, please. And from that, we boiled down to 8 principles of carbon conscious places, which will address climate resilience. A place-led approach, so focusing on alignment in the place, a place of small distances, so people have heard of 20-minute neighbourhoods. The network of small distance places, so linking places together, designing places for and with local people, so there's buy-in, there's understanding, there's local knowledge, reducing, reusing, repurposing and considering whole life costs of places and the buildings and places within it, looking at whole and circular systems, and a place that supports sharing of ideas and materials and skills, and a place designed in time. I think many of us working in landscape are familiar with that, this idea of that this is a long-term, forever type project that understands change and growth. And we've shared a number of different examples of all of these types of principles, where linking people by transport, using place standard to understand people's local areas better, local art projects and sharing projects, and some repurposing stuff and going on in Glasgow. So there's lots of good examples we can discuss in the breakout groups. One of the things that we've also been looking at is this idea of Scotland in 2050, what the landscape will be like at all scales, urban scales, town scales, neighbourhood scales, rural scales, and how they're all connected in a connected system of approaches where landscape is at the centre of delivering better places. The next one, please. Yes, thanks. And one key example we've been working on just now, part of the key agencies group, is in Kilmarnock, where we're looking at the sites within the town centre being more available and usable for town centre living, but looking at a whole river systems approach in terms of land use change beyond the town itself, in terms of delivering nature-based solutions that will enable parts of the urban areas to be better used, and innovative uses of the rural areas. Next, please. And another piece of exciting work we've been doing with Nature Scotland and a number of other partners down the south of Scotland is around the Hagshot Energy Cluster, looking at the change transition into a second generation of wind turbines, and seeing how that can benefit the landscape, enhance the landscape, and provide local economic and leisure benefits and tourism benefits for the local communities there, and using all the knowledge of the local communities to feed into that approach. So again, a collaborative approach. We also looked at housing in place and the role that a landscape approach to housing and a place-based approach to housing can make a difference. And the key things that were coming out there was that there needs to be a place-based approach to housing. This isn't about delivering just houses, it's about creating places. And that requires improved development briefs to be produced by local authorities and working with the stakeholders in these areas. And key to the planning of this is to provide access to high quality landscapes and green spaces through the design, delivery, maintenance and collaboration of this, so that everybody has a chance to get access to green space. A good example we like to share is at Fraser Avenue in Inverkeithing, where a very stigmatised, ghettoised location which didn't work for people was redesigned so that it tied in and darned into the rest of the town, recentered the gravity of the shopping and services to be closer to other neighbourhoods as well, so that rather than being an isolated location, it became a new tied in place where people are actually saying for the first time in a generation, children are playing outside, they're meeting their neighbours again, they're able to walk to the shops safely, and they're proud of the place, and actually health indicators are showing that there's been significant changes in improvement in people's health. Next, thanks. And Countess Wells up in Aberdeen, large scale urban expansion, but one that ties into the landscape, uses nature-based solutions at large scale to provide blue and green infrastructure at scale, and it creates a really, really attractive landscape framework for the housing that's happening there, and one which demonstrated strong interdepartmental relationships within the council to help deliver this. Next, please. And in Dunbeg, we worked using the place standard with local communities to expand a rural community to tie into the cultural and landscape situation there in a way that actually reflected the needs of the people, which was based on an economic angle, design quality and local facilities, and the whole area being very walkable. So that idea that it was designed by the people for their own needs rather than being an imposed solution. Next, please. And thank you. And the final one there was one where a strategic approach has been done at Western Bartonshire, where some of the great work they've been doing there around the local plan development has been about putting green infrastructure and design first within their own local policy. They're building with nature, and they got that accreditation, and they have put supplementary guidance about green infrastructure into their local development plans. So they're really being serious about this, so that from the start they're informed in terms of their own brief writing and what's expected from themselves and from developers. So some great work we'd happily chat about and forms the basis of our discussions for later on. So thanks, Rachel.
Thank you very much for that, Danny. Some really good examples there of what good looks like and what we just need to do more of it in Scotland. So our next area, I'm conscious of time and we've gone a little bit over, so apologies if this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour here, but we're looking at food and food security. And we saw opportunities in developing an integrated and sustainable food policy, food growing as a priority leading to reduced health inequalities, and using place-based working. Opportunities for creating community resilience, improving the local economy, and raising awareness of the benefits of local growing. So best practice examples that we found include neighbourhood food, which connects buyers with locally produced food, and Glasgow Food Policy Partnership, Good Food for All, working collaboratively towards a city where everyone can enjoy healthy, affordable, fresh local food. Also Urban Roots, Food for Thought project, partnership working to develop skills-based programmes around food growing and cookery with local communities. Now a couple of European examples of good practice. The Montpellier Markets Food Miles initiative. Labelling enables buyers to make choices about food miles. And this is the ultimate that Scotland should aim for, the largest urban rooftop farm, embedding food production with the byproducts of the city's processes and systems, residual heat, water runoff, food waste, and reducing food miles. So what can landscape deliver for education? The opportunities are for equitable access for all user groups to local high quality green space for all types of education purposes. That everyone has access to outdoor learning in green space, as well as opportunities for volunteering or learning about nature or land-based careers. Good practice examples underway are Nature Scots Learning in Local Green Space Resource Pack, enabling schools or groups to go beyond their own grounds to learn outdoors. 2 teacher training institutes have recently developed new outdoor learning programs to train teachers of the future to embed outdoor learning in their practice. And the Future Parks Accelerator project, Naturally Birmingham, which is looking at green spaces in relation to vulnerable children's education, as well as their Green Champion training programme for volunteers. Finally, we looked at what landscape can deliver for health and well-being. And there is a huge amount of evidence around this, including our own position statement that was published last year, as well as people's own personal experiences of the health benefits. So our main opportunities here are around the obvious improvements to physical and mental health, the reduction in health inequalities, plus enabling a good start for young people and creating community cohesion. Our best practice example is a Building with Nature award winner and demonstration of the place principle, organisations working together and providing joint funding. There are multiple health spin-offs from the project, with the first UK hospital ranger working directly with patients and local people. Now let's look at the network of people and what landscape can deliver for them. We saw opportunities around decision-making and ways of working, leading on scales of change and funding and partnering. Also opportunities for community empowerment. Our best practice example demonstrates where large scales of change, such as retrofitting, needs large-scale leadership and vision. Glasgow Avenues project, retrofitting cycling, walking and green infrastructure. Also partnership working with the Glasgow Smart Canal, a new digital surface water drainage system mitigating flood risk that has enabled development land across North Glasgow for regeneration and creating multifunctional green space for communities. There are public campaigns and initiatives such as those by Keep Scotland Beautiful, which provide support mechanisms and education for communities. And also the new Glasgow Ownership Hub, supporting community buyouts in urban areas. Finally, how do we measure success? What data do we need that we don't have yet? There are three key areas we have seen in our research around the quality of landscape, food systems, and the place principle, but there are bound to be more. So that's a very brief tour of the group work to date under this policy opportunity. And these are our summarised draft recommendations. There's 7 of them, which we will examine further as part of the debate to establish if these are the right priorities. Are there more barriers or opportunities to overcome them? So I look forward to chairing this debate. So thank you very much for this. I'll now hand you over to David Miller for the third of our public policy opportunities.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Stuart. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Just summarise some of the approaches and thinking of the working group looking at landscapes and climate change and the just transition. David Miller's my name from James Hutton Institute. I'm co-convening this group with Sarah Govan from Climate Exchange, Edinburgh University. The two foci of the discussion to date are the Scottish Government's climate change plan and the Just Transition, and the report from the Just Transition Commission. What we want to do is to think through to what extent landscapes are part of the approaches of societal responses to climate change, both in mitigation and adaptation, but what it means going forward and over the long term in terms of equalities and rights. And this is partly reflecting the clear priorities there are of government and its agencies, but also the responsibilities through business and civil society as a whole. So our questions for the working group, been thinking through so far how we get to net zero, climate resilient economy in ways that delivers fairness and tackle inequality and injustice. And thinking about the investment that many of you also contributed to in the position papers of last year, how does the Climate Change Plan and the Just Transition Commission and its reporting back map on to the desired outcomes from Scotland's Landscape Alliance? Thus far, there seems to be a considerable intersection of the Climate Change Action Plan and opportunities for achieving some of those outcomes. And Just Transition has got a little bit less of a direct connection, but clearly, as everyone will recognise, it's how one then interprets the boundaries and the opportunities that we want to take and where we see landscape as part of the story. So this is just to help bring us back to thinking through the links to the objectives of the Alliance. What we've done within the group so far is think about these 3 questions: Scotland's landscape and net zero. What are those issues to be addressed? How can landscape be at the heart of the just transition? What's its functions, its roles? What are the pressures that we might put on it? Where are the barriers to opportunity of transitions? And what are the tools that exist? What are the policy tools? Who are the people and the emerging players and organisations with whom we should be working as an alliance? Now, as part of this engagement. Sarah's created a Padlet. We'll introduce that to you later on. That's an online tool for capturing some observations, thinking, ideas. I'm going to share 3 slides with you just now, which draw on some of the content thus far from that Padlet. And just to pick out a couple of items that come from the discussions under each of these 3 questions. And the first one is to note that, well, in terms of transitions to net zero and pathways to net zero and public policy, whether that's global, European, UK or Scotland, the comments are that it does not feel like an emergency. The actions taken on the ground, the support for that is a little less like an emergency. Not that one would necessarily wish to be advocating for the sorts of crises that we see in other realms, but it's certainly not the sort of responses that we see to COVID or to some other forms of emergency, which may indeed themselves be as a consequence of climate change. There's probably a good argument to say that we're not coherent in the way in which policies link together and how they deliver. Some of those are relatively new and need to mature and evolve, but nonetheless, there's a weakness there. And a lot of the analysis and the high-level messages come from modelling, and that might not easily connect with experiences on the ground or how to deliver on the ground. Though we just heard some examples from in the previous presentation. So how do we communicate the issues of landscape and delivery to net zero? What are the different perspectives from policy, practitioner, community across age ranges, across abilities? And to what extent do we collectively really understand the nature of the changes and the causes of the changes that are, I think most people would expect and believe, required? So putting landscape at the heart of the just transition, the issues we'd like to hear more comment on and feedback include what is understood by fairness. How do we go about putting visions and debates and landscapes to the fore, and what are the processes that really enable contributions from across peoples? And inequalities mapped onto landscapes, and the thought that, as one can in other realms and other areas and ways of life, that some of us can buy out or buy into landscapes and change. We could opt, arguably, to live close to or further away from where there are large-scale afforestation, wind farms, power stations, other things. But how is that going to be thought through going forward and recognise the long-term evolution of landscapes in response to climate change, as well as the reduction or tackling of inequalities across society as a whole? And what sort of information and tools are there? Well, we heard indeed about the place principle just a few minutes ago and how that might and does help link landscape and community. Another phrase that will become more and more familiar, I suspect and anticipate, is what of open science and open data. And some of Scottish Government's work this very year is on how to make data available for the emerging regional land use partnerships. But how will they use those data? What will the data offer? What extent are they going to be more than provision of information? How can that really make a difference to enabling and facilitating the dialogue and debates? And
David,
a final observation then.
Sorry, David, just to interrupt you. Sorry, David, I really don't want to interrupt you, but I'm not sure we're seeing your slides in sequence on the screen.
Ah.
I think we're actually seeing your last slide.
Oh, are you? Oh dear.
Yes.
Ah. Well, there's no. I think we'll not rehearse them all again.
Yes. Okay. We don't have time for that, but
realistic. But I'll just conclude then by apologising for that. But thank you for intervening, because I'm merrily looking at those slides, and secondly saying that we'll rehearse a couple of those slides and observations in the breakout session that will follow shortly.
Yeah, that's fine. That's good. Thank you, David. Okay, Could we move on now, please? We're running slightly behind time, and I will shorten the break by 5 minutes, and if necessary, we'll have a kind of hard cut off at 12. I don't want to run on beyond that. So can we move on to Dermot, please, Head of Policy at the National Trust for Scotland. Dermot's been chairing the Environment Strategy Group.
Stuart. Just to check, we are seeing what other people are seeing. Can you see a title slide there?
Yes.
Excellent. And if it doesn't move, do let me know.
So if you go to slide view, yeah, perfect.
Slide view. Great.
Thanks, Dermot.
Thanks. And thank you. So I'm going to introduce the work of Working Group 4, which is looking at the development and application of indicators in landscape-related policies in Scotland. And we're all familiar with the idea that what gets measured gets managed. And this is often seen as a double-edged sword, that we might overlook what's important simply because we cannot easily measure it, or that we become focused on chasing after targets and forget that our measurement is only one part of a much richer and more complex picture. But we also know that public policy revolves around measurement of outputs of results, opinions, and these are the data that identify where there are shortcomings, where markets are not performing, and where public intervention might be required. The management and enhancement of our landscapes has not been prominent in our public policy debates in Scotland. Is this due to a lack of data, a lack of reliable indicators, or a perceived lack of relevance to people? Other areas of public policy also grapple with these issues. To highlight a couple of related areas, the historic environment is measured at national level through the condition of pre-1919 buildings. There are a number of other available data sets, scheduled monuments, listed buildings, plan applications, or demolitions, but this indicator was thought by the community to be the best compromise between coverage, condition, and measurement of change. For natural heritage, there's a very wide range of measurements on the condition and range of our species and habitats. But in the context of the National Performance Indicator, National Performance Framework, the biodiversity is measured through a combination of the abundance of marine species, abundance of terrestrial species, and the occupancy of terrestrial species. Other sectors have then more or less settled on an acceptable proxy for their area of interest, considering the benefits of being present in such frameworks outweighs the known limitations in their coverage or quality. Can something similar be done for landscape issues? Working Group 4 is looking at this challenge, including with reference to the Scottish Environment Strategy that's currently in development, but there are also a number of other upcoming opportunities to inject landscape concerns into the public debate. These include the forthcoming revision of the National Performance Framework itself, the development of a new agricultural and forestry support system, and the rollout of regional land use partnerships. In none of these areas is landscape itself currently a feature, although many of the decisions made under these policy areas will affect our landscapes. So where are we at the moment? Nature Scot has a number of landscape-related indicators in place already. These include the extent and impact of built development, land cover, the area covered by landscape designations, and public perceptions of Scotland's landscapes. Nature Scot is also working with Historic Environment Scotland on the development of 5 new indicators, with 3 due this year and 2 in 2022. These include the mapping of urban green space, the coverage of local landscape areas, and vacant and derelict land. More ambitiously, they also include measures of climate-related landscape change and the design quality of the built environment itself. Together, these might give us a comprehensive suite of land use measures, but are they enough to understand how people perceive and value our landscapes? And are they perhaps too focused on what we have at present and not enough on how our landscapes might be in the future? In discussing how we might measure landscape qualities in public policy, one theme to emerge from the group was the tangible and the intangible. That is, it's relatively easy to measure the tangible, quantifiable, physical components of landscapes and how these are changing. But it's much more difficult to measure how these components interact to produce landscapes, and what such landscapes mean to people as individuals or as communities, or what the priorities or concerns are in managing these changes. For landscape particularly, there's also the challenge of the level of measurement. For many of our national indicators, we take only a national measurement, often sourced from the Scottish Household Survey. This is robust at national level, but cannot adequately capture what's happening or not happening across our many varied landscapes or what's happening at local level. As a group, we recognise that there are many approaches to engage communities in valuing places, but that these require resource and need to be carefully handled. One challenge is who's responding to these engagement opportunities, who has the immediate interest or time to become involved. There could also be variations in responses depending which organisation itself is asking the questions. One quick example of how different perceptions can be is a piece of research looking at how different age groups perceive the care of their local environment. This was research carried out by NTS to look at landscape change, and we found that different age cohorts had very different perceptions of the same phenomena, to which we could add many other social and economic characteristics that people can be defined by or identify themselves with. And when considering landscapes and landscape features, who should we be engaging with? The current emphasis in Scottish public policy is on the resident community, as we see in the Community Empowerment Act, the Land Reform Act, or local place plans, but we can miss what places mean to other communities. The challenge is illustrated by the Tinker's Heart Monument in Argyll, where local resident communities and the travelling community had very different perceptions of value and therefore of what needed to be done. In fact, for the travelling community, this site was associated with the 1745 Rising and had been used to celebrate weddings since the 1800s. Historic Environment Scotland eventually resolved this by consulting with both local and non-local communities, and then finally designating the site as a scheduled monument. And what else might be missing? Related to this is the kind of language that we need to express how and why we value our landscapes. The working groups observed that other cultures may be more comfortable in expressing these ideas, that they may have a language that better expresses how people relate to the land. One example is New Zealand, for the Maori language is the concept of whenua, which is the word for both land and placenta. It is used to capture the sense of belonging to the land, to be natural, to be at home. And this is now written into the relevant legislation. Do we ourselves need to do more to develop a vocabulary that captures how landscapes inform and sustain our identities? Would this enable us to better connect with what people value and what is changing in their landscapes? These are challenging areas, and the working group will need to consider where it can best position its efforts over the next several months. Our public policies on the environment and agriculture and forestry, on urban development, on power generation transmission are all in a state of ferment. Now is a good time to be working on these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dermot. And thank you to all our presenters and for dealing with the technical challenges of all of that. So we're only running 5 minutes behind now. So can I just ask you to take a very short break and be back with us maybe 11:05, please. It's important that you come back and you'll then be sent off into your breakout rooms. You'll need to probably click on a little dialog box to go into your breakout rooms. We'll keep the facilitated group discussions to the 30 minutes and we'll just shave off 5 minutes in the summing up time. So everybody will be away by 12. Okay, thanks everybody. So back please 11:05 on the dot. Thanks very much. So, okay, recording in progress. So that's everybody back, I think. Okay, so this is probably the biggest challenge of the day, once we get beyond the technology, is to try and sum up from the chairs some of the discussion and debate that we've just had in those rooms. I don't think it's ever going to be perfect, by the way. I think all we can do is kind of give a flavour of things. And I'll kind of say a few words at the end about how we might make some sense of all of this and the kind of next steps. So is it okay if we just go back through in order? John Thompson, I think you're first up, if that's all right.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, well, we started off with a fairly fundamental point about whether traditional landscape thinking and approaches had been too anthropocentric. And I think the conclusion to that was, yes, they had. And this was an opportunity to move towards something which had a broader focus than that. But at the same time, I think it was implicit that that would involve some sort of widening of horizons from other perspectives as well. And the point was made, for example, that a lot of traditional nature protection thinking was focused very much on the biotic and rather neglected the abiotic, the geology which underlies all the natural systems anyway. So I think there was the feeling we need that more holistic view, if I can put it that way. But we certainly shouldn't just regard nature as being something that was useful and beneficial to humans. There were wider values than that. We also highlighted the role that landscape and the human dimension that I've just been talking about, particularly historically, if you built upon an environmental history view of the world, could help you with the process, not just of engaging with people, but also with increasing their understanding. And that was seen as fundamental, that there was a major educational challenge, and bringing a landscape perspective to bear could help with that in terms of getting better understanding of ecosystems, how they operate and how they contribute to human well-being, but help to sustain the planet more generally. So a big emphasis on that. I think recognition that we do need to move towards the sort of place-based approach that was being discussed in quite a lot of the other working groups, that there is going to be a big spectrum from areas where something like a minimum intervention regime is appropriate to ones which are much more actively managed for a whole range of outputs, including some of the traditional land outputs. And therefore that we obviously need mechanisms, although we didn't get into this, but mechanisms that would help us to identify and agree the sort of objectives that there should be. And I think finally, I think we did feel that protected landscapes, although they might not ever in their entirety justify counting towards a 30 by 30 target, they could certainly play a major part both in trying to ensure the appropriate management of areas that did, because that is one of the big challenges, but they could also help very much towards putting in place the better management, the sustainable management, call it what you will, of the whole of our land, all our land, in a way that really put overall ecosystem health at the center of what we were trying to achieve. And I think there was a strong feeling that ecosystem health was very much the overall objective, and that landscape considerations should be fed into that and used to help to achieve it. And I think that's probably covered most of the ground. I'll stop at that point.
Okay, thank you, John. Rachel, are you happy to feedback?
Yeah, absolutely. We just looked at the 7 summary recommendations. We took the overall kind of reference to the programme for Scotland, landscape and green space is an asset that can help support resilient, inclusive and diverse communities. And everybody agreed that that was appropriate link. We looked then at the 7 recommendations to see if they needed to be added to or any comments on them. And generally everyone felt that the multifunctional landscape first approach was the right way to go. The second point was around access to local quality landscape and green space. There was quite a lot of debate around this, particularly in relation to access for everyone rather than all communities. And every time there is a mention of rights, there should be a responsibility clause. And so there was something around maybe adding more on education awareness for communities, so that we can ensure appropriate behaviours, but also landowners' responsibilities as well. So there's potentially one that we can expand into community awareness, another recommendation there. The next one was healthy food and growing opportunities, and people commented on the fact that maybe we should be expanding that into energy as well. Can we also include energy somewhere within our recommendation, so it's not just about food, it's about other things that we can have from the ownership of our local landscapes. I'm sure I've missed out something there, but I'm just reading somebody else's notes, so it's quite difficult. And the fourth one, place principle, which I've spelt wrong on all the slides, sorry about that. Absolutely, always first, but it is a continuum. It isn't just about a tick box, it's about making sure that we keep doing that. And the fifth one was a leading on landscape scales of change. I'm sorry, I'm just going to go back. There was also points made about ensuring that the quality landscape was also about environmental quality, the fact that the degradation of our landscape has occurred, especially in urban areas, around the fact it's poorly maintained, or there's a lot of litter everywhere. So there's quite a bit of information about that as well. Leading on landscape scales of change. There was no comments on that everybody agreed on that. Gathering and sharing landscape data. There was a lot of interesting comment about the fact that data is being collected. There's a lot of data, but there's an issue around open data and sharing that, whether we're allowed to, whether organizations are allowed to share that. So there's an issue around transparency there. And the final one was funding mechanisms and partnering. Looking at how some of these things are delivered now, lots of information about green nature bonds or climate bonds, how are they being delivered? Also looking at mentoring through, if we're getting lottery funding for projects, mentoring and technical help early, so that communities can get advice early on in that. I think that's very poor summing up, but there was a lot of debate around that. We were looking at the barriers as well, but that's where we got cut off. So I've asked people to share their thoughts with me. Sorry, it's a bit of a rambly.
That's okay, Rachel. It's a very difficult thing to do.
I can't.
Okay, all right. The next challenger is David then. David Miller.
Thanks very much, Stuart. Thanks to those that joined us in the discussion on the climate change plan, Just Transition. I'll cherry pick a few of the items that arose, and I'll pick up with the comment Rachel ended on data and data availability, because that was also one element of discussion about how we can bring elements together most effectively from the data we have available, and progressively how there is a diversification in the sources of information, with greater inputs from citizens as well. I'm going to just pull out a couple of other broad headings here. One of the opportunities is about contributing to and thinking about what the new structures might be that can take better overview of where land use goes in future. Three were highlighted: the land use strategy, which of course also includes the regional land use partnerships, forthcoming renewal of the climate change plan. I think interpretation was in the next 18 months or 2 years, and also progressively a successor to the forest and woodland strategies, that of a Scottish forest strategy. And the piloting and testing out of some of that was brought to the table by a couple of contributors. So the observation here is the need for better integration and joining up top down that meets equitably bottom up aspirations, fears, hopes and thinking, but that there is a lack of connection across what we want nationally, where nationally also of course includes seascapes, so the coast, and how we achieve that equitably from our land. And that touched on a variety of other elements: the planning system, the legacies of land uses, which now may not all contribute to the overall objectives of climate change just transitions, and also the inherent inconsistencies and to an extent incompatibilities of different sectors, different agencies, different parts of business as well perhaps, One observation brought to the fore was that about moorland management, grazing pressures and debates and discussions thereof, and how that can be made more compatible with the choice of species of tree if woodland expansion is one of our big contributors to increasing their sequestration of greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm going to finish on just reflecting then on timelines, that I think over the next 8 weeks, we're going to hear a great deal more about how short the actions or the time for actions is going to be. But many of our approaches require timelines that may not be compatible with that, whether it is peatland restoration and reducing emissions, whether it is the actual impacts of afforestation, whether it's changes in behaviours. And some of that and the long-term change and impacts on landscape and other components of landscape, long-term change in soil health is another one that connects into this, will need thought through and probably is part of the messages we need to articulate. So rates of change in landscape and rates of change in the drivers of landscape may be two of the things that emerge from this working group and more broadly. And with that, I will stop. Oh, I should say the Padlet is open and open for anyone who wishes to contribute. And with that, I'll stop.
Thanks, David. And we'll share your slides so people can see the link. We'll put that on our website. Okay, final one then, the group I attended, which was a really good discussion led by Dermot Ernst. Thanks.
Yeah, quite as all these are quite expansive topics. We started by looking at the existing suite of indicators. I didn't detect any great enthusiasm for any particular one of them, but there's an acceptance that these exist and they're tied to what's immediately measurable, but also to what's a kind of statutory duty for many of the organisations involved, the public authority organisations. So we need to keep measuring those. The greatest interest really was around about the NatureScope measurement of public perception on landscape and how that was executed. And could it be extended and developed, particularly down to regional level, potentially down to local level? So that's, I think, an area for the working group to look at how that indicator might be applied further. And that then led on to discussion about what we're measuring, why we're measuring it, and this idea of the tangible, the intangible. Perhaps more to say what's immediately quantifiable and what's less readily measurable, and that's about the value people put in the landscape. And we did indeed have a discussion about the development of language. There's mention of hygge, Jaikatala dance, but that Danish idea of coziness, of comfort, and did we perhaps need similar language in Scotland? We certainly have a similar climate, but do we need a better way of connecting with people and how they value landscape? But beyond just how people perceive landscape and value it, what does landscape do for people? What does it underpin? And that led us on to the idea of well-being, that actually, even if people aren't immediately making a connection with landscape and landscape policy, there may be aspects of their well-being that are related to that. And that could also be a fruitful area to explore. And it's one that cuts across the working groups that we have here, particularly the health group. So how to measure that, how to connect with people in terms of language. And then as a final point, we got onto the new national park that will happen this parliamentary period. So that's the first national park in 20 years. Scotland, you know, lag behind England and the wider world in terms of creating national parks. But people perceive the value of national parks in different ways. The purpose of national parks, there's the immediate landscape that frames national parks, but within that, there's the economics, the socials, the environmental. There'll be national aspirations for a national park, but also local communities and their aspirations. So in very real time, immediately, we're going to see landscape policy put to the test in quite an interesting way, in a way that we've not done for a couple of decades. So it's quite a timely time to be looking at how we measure people's relationship to the landscape.
Thank you, Dermot. Okay, well done, everybody. That's always going to be a bit of a challenge. And thanks also for keeping us time. So we've caught up. Okay, so just in terms of some next steps here. Firstly, actually, just a couple of thanks, particularly thanks to Janine Ballantyne at NTS for managing the Zoom. So well done, Janine, and thanks for that, and the breakout room. So it was a bit of a test for us, but I think we kind of more or less pulled it off. Thanks also to all the chairs of the working group. So obviously a lot of work goes in the run-up to this through the discussions and trying to coordinate that, as well as just the meeting itself and the scribes in the groups. And thanks also, obviously, for all your contributions too. So just in terms of next steps, there's a couple of tasks for us at the Landscape Alliance. If you aren't familiar, by the way, with our website, I should just remind everybody of where that is. Okay, so it's pretty simple, Scotland's landscapealliance.org. So we will attempt to upload the various presentations that we've shared today onto the website. And David, that means that we'll be able to see the detail of yours as well. We will give, I think, everybody to the end of next week, if they wanted to make I appreciate, we've not been able to have a kind of a wider group discussion here. It was more facilitated in the working groups. But if people feel that they've got something to say that they weren't able to say today, and spend a little bit of time, I suppose, crafting that, we're really happy to receive kind of written, I would say, submissions. You can do that either directly to the working group chairs that you heard from, or just come through the SLA website, and any messages there come through to myself and Rachel, and we can direct them. So any written submissions, please, by I would say Friday the 15th of October. So that gives you kind of nearly 10 days. We obviously picked these topics because they're relevant and they're live, and there'll be different opportunities for us to feed in, but we will kind of make sense of what we've heard today and refine our thinking and pull that together and share that back out with you, the community. I think that's really important, because as well as the SLA working on your behalf, if you like, kind of making these submissions and ideas where the opportunities arise in these 4 areas, I think it's also really important that you get to see these kind of reference points and can speak also for the Landscape Alliance and making your own submissions. So we will share those back out as we did last year with our publications. Now, I don't think we're kind of looking at a kind of glossy design in these elements. I think it's more the ideas that we want to be able to communicate. So we will do that over the coming weeks and have something back out to share, I think, via our website, and we can obviously communicate that as well via an email to the group. There's lots of other people that are connected in with the Alliance that weren't able to make the meeting today, so it's important that they understand what the outcome of the debate is. Rachel and I have been kind of meeting with various government officials over the last few months, and we'll continue to do that. And we do have I think a live meeting request in with Lorna Slater, who wasn't able to join us today. But that's another good opportunity, I think, to be able to convey some of these messages that you've helped to kind of shape. So we'll kind of keep our fingers crossed that we get that opportunity sooner rather than later. Okay, I think that's us. Rachel, was there anything that you'd like to add to that?
I just want to thank my working group for all their input, and I think everybody has had great input into their individual groups. So I don't think so. I think that's good summing up. And I have said to my group that I would email them directly with my presentation, as I think immediately then they can start looking at it and add further thoughts to it. But I'll also put it on the website as well, so they've got access there.
Okay, brilliant. All right, well, thanks everybody. That's us just on time. So thanks again for all your input, and I guess we'll see you next time.
Okay, thanks very much. Bye everyone.
Thanks
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.